Good morning, class. Before we get into all the events that we're learning about today, I want us first to go over the major rulers of the 14th century. So we're going to mostly focus in on England and France and also go over a ruler from the Ottoman Empire and the Timurid Empire. Okay, so we're going to start with Edward the First of England. He ruled from 1272 to 1307. He's known for taxing the clergy, successful campaigns in Wales, trying to take Scotland, and facing William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Next, we're going to go over to Edward II. Edward II ruled from 1307 in England to 1327. He married a 12-year-old French princess who was the daughter of Philip IV. He had an unstable rule. There was much infighting, wars against Scotland. He was hated by his own wife, forced by his wife and Roger Mortimer to relinquish his crown to his young 14-year-old son, Edward III. Some say he was the second worst king of England. Okay, let's move on to his son. We've got Edward III. Edward III ruled from 1327 to 1377. He was known for his military success in restoring royal authority. He ruled for 55 years. At age 17, he led a coup against Mortimer and had Mortimer brutally murdered. If the word overkill means anything to you, it's very much what happened here. He declared himself the rightful heir to the French throne. He started the 100-Year War. During that time, they used longbows and cannons for the first time. Also, during his rule, the Black Plague hit Europe. Unlike previous kings, Edward III spoke English more than he spoke French. He also employed the famous author Gregory Chaucer, the man who wrote Canterbury Tales. He is the one who started using what is now the modern-day English flag. Sadly for Edward III, the end of his life was very sad. He outlived most of his family members and most of his friends. Next, we move on to Richard II. Richard II took over in 1377 and ruled until 1399. Richard became king at the young age of 10. He dealt with the peasant revolt in his lifetime. He tried to end the 100-Year War, and sadly, the last 2 years of his life was called a tyrannical rule. He ended up being deposed in 1399. Now we're going to start talking about the rulers of France. Unlike the rulers of England, we're not going to go over all the rulers of this century. That's because there were 9 different kings that ruled in France during the 14th century. Some of them lived less than a year. So we're only going to go over the 5 major kings of the 14th century for France. The first ruler is Philip IV. Philip IV started ruling in 1285. They called him Philip the Fair because of him being handsome. Philip is known for his struggle with the Roman Catholic Church and consolidating royal power. The next king we're going to go over is Charles IV. Charles started ruling in 1322 and died in 1328. He was the youngest son of Philip IV. He died without a male heir. He was the end of his dynasty. Next, we're going to move over to Philip VI. Philip VI ruled from 1328 to 1350. He was the grandson of Philip III. He was known for his succession dispute, and he was the king that was ruling at the start of the 100-Year War. Moving on to King John II of France. He ruled from 1350 to 1364. He's known for being captured by the English and being forced to sign treaties. Last on this list, we have Charles. This is Charles VI. Poor Charles. He ruled from 1380 to 1422. He was known as Charles the Mad because he suffered different bouts of mental illness throughout his life. He became king at the age of 12. During some of these bouts of mental illness, he would think that he was glass and could break at any time. He also was known to attack his own guards for fear for his life. To finish up our timeline for the 14th century, we need to first go over to the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire in 1360, a man named Sultan Murad I became ruler. He was an amazing military leader, and he expanded the empire. He died a martyr at war. The next man we're going to go over was a man who started his own empire. He was Turco-Mongol. He believed himself to be a descendant of Attila the Hun. I always get those two mixed up. Attila the Hun. He created what is called the Timurid Empire. His name was Timur the Lame. He was born 1336 and died in 1405. He was a conqueror and a bloodthirsty murderer who built his kingdom on murdering people and taking their land and their goods and their people. Now it's time to go over the 14th century, a century full of death, war, and conflict. A terrible time to be alive. Okay, so this century, we're going to start out with Edward I and Philip IV. So that's Edward of England and Philip of France. Guess what? The two of them are not getting along. Surprise, surprise. They're wanting to fight each other, but they're running low on money. How do they get more money? Through taxes. They decide to try something a little bit different than they've done in the past. They decide to go and tax the church, the Catholic Church. They're going to charge the clergy taxes, which the Pope is not a big fan of. The Pope tells them that no one has the right to the church. No one has the right to tax the church except for the Pope, and immediately tells them they're not allowed to do what they are wanting to do. Edward I of England has a plan. He took the church's property and made it illegal for the clergy not to pay taxes. Philip IV also has a plan. He puts an embargo on shipments of gold, silver, and jewels to be sent to the Pope. Well, the Pope is not a big fan of these two different issues. The Pope decides to say, you know what? I was wrong. It's okay. You can tax us, but only in emergencies. Edward I, he was okay with that. He was like, okay, this is an emergency. I'm going to tax you. And not that Philip IV was not okay with it, but he later will exploit this, and it will not be a good thing for the Pope. There ends up being a lot of conflict between Philip and the Pope over a large period of time. Eventually, Philip is said to have sent some people after the Pope to kidnap him. And after the Pope was kidnapped, the Pope had people come to rescue him. But within 3 weeks, the Pope died. Some people think that this stress on an elderly Pope caused him to die. But nevertheless, the Pope is gone. And of course, Philip is going to take advantage of this opportunity. He sees a chance to get his archbishop inside the church as the Pope. And that's exactly what happens. King Philip IV has his archbishop put as Pope, and the Pope moves to France and actually rules out of France for a number of years. So the church is now on the side of France. Now, this is going to lead to a lot of different issues inside of the Catholic Church over the next 100 years, and they're going to go through a lot of popes, even having more than one pope at a time. But we're not going to discuss that for right now. Edward I decides to campaign into Wales and Scotland. He takes Wales, but has a lot more trouble with Scotland. He deals with people like William Wallace, and all of the Scots hate him. Another problem with Edward I going after Scotland is that France has agreed to protect Scotland. And because England has duchies over in France, they're supposed to be obedient to this rule that the French king has put into place. So, by Edward I going into Scotland on a campaign to take it, it's like declaring war on France. Now, one important thing to know before we get into the 100 Years' War is that France was built up of a bunch of things called duchies. And you can kind of think of the duchies as states. And in charge of each of these duchies is a duke. And that duke had to be a vessel for the French king. They were supposed to be obedient to the French king. Now, it didn't always work out that way because these dukes could actually build up armies and collect taxes and such. But that's what was expected. Now, these different duchies were not always the same size. They would expand, they would shrink depending on the different wars and conflicts or marriage alliances that have been made. Here we have a few of the different duchies at one point in time, and some of these are ones that England got their claws into. So up here at the top we have Normandy, and over to the side is Brittany, and then there's Aquitaine, which we got to learn about not too long ago, and then Burgundy, and up towards the right corner, not completely in the corner, is Paris, and around Paris is the area that the King of France actually truly owns. Other than that, they were people who had to be obedient to him, but they got to rule their own sections of France. Now, this is where it got complicated and where the conflict between England and France really got started. In 1066, with William the Conqueror, William the Conqueror brings Normandy as part of the land to England. He is ruling both of them. And over time, different kings get different parts of the land. And as we learned earlier, in an earlier lesson, Eleanor of Aquitaine actually brings that land to her husband through marriage. So at certain points in time, England owns about a third of France. And this causes, a lot of conflict because these kings do not want to be obedient to the King of France in the ways that they are supposed to. As I had mentioned earlier, by Edward I going on a conquest into Scotland, he was going against what he was supposed to do as ruling a duchy in France. So over and over, there's complications. As we learned about with King John from England, the people of France kept on taking the land away from him. So it's just a series of kings coming and taking portions of France and then losing portions of France. So many different wars end up happening with the English rulers trying to take more and more of France, and then the French people trying to get France back. So what it really comes down to is France was a nation of duchies, and the English ruled some of them. This awkward arrangement created lots of problems. The French wanted the English out of their country, and the English just wanted more of France without having to follow their rules. This and some other factors are really the main reason for the 100-Year War happening. It's a complex, awkward situation that keeps on leading over and over to conflict and war. Edward the First has a son, and his name is Edward II. And Edward II actually ends up marrying Philip IV's daughter when she's 12 years old. This marriage does not turn out very good for either of them. It ends in his wife leading a revolt and kicking Edward II out of office. This causes their son, Edward III, to become king at a very, very early age. It also leads Edward III to become furious with his mother and mother's friend, Mortimer. And he ends up, when he's 17, leading a coup and killing Mortimer. First by hanging him, then by chopping off his head, then having him quartered. So, he's definitely dead. Moving on from that, though, an interesting thing to learn is that now Philip IV's grandson is Edward III. Now, in France, this doesn't mean anything when it comes to inheritance. The females do not pass on any land or roles. So, if it does not put Edward III in line in the French people's eyes. However, Philip IV has some sons, but they all die. The last one dies, leaving no heir. And by there being no heir, the French royals have to find someone to take his place. They end up getting one of Philip III's grandsons to step in and become king. His name is Philip VI, and he rules from 1328 to 1350. And at first, Edward III has no problems really with this. However, after a certain amount of turmoil with France, Edward III decides to claim France as his, as Edward III being the rightful heir to the French throne. Now Edward III claims himself to be king of both France and of England. He starts fighting many battles against the king of France. Of course, he doesn't consider him to be the king of France. This is King Philip VI. After one of the great victories that Edward III has against Philip, he ends up adding the French design to the lines of his coat of arms. So you'll always see the mixture of the blue and the red fabric designs on his clothing to symbolize that he is the king of both of these two nations. And he does this in 1340. He continued to win many battles against France. He won a battle in 1346 and another big battle in 1347, taking different portions of France, which there lead to him having more ability to fight and rule in France. At the Battle of Poitiers, the English capture the new French king, who is John II, who had succeeded Philip VI in 1350. All of these different battles are part of this really huge long war called the 100 Years' War. Interesting enough, though, the 100-Year War is not 100 years long. It actually goes over a period of 116 years, and it takes breaks at different times and then starts up again at different times. But the 116-year war doesn't sound as cool as the 100-year war, so that is what people call it. England had part rules of France for roughly 200 years now, thanks to William the Conqueror and Eleanor of Aquitaine. France was ready to be rid of the English, and this war started, the 100 Years' War, with Edward III and Philip VI. 10 years after the start of the 100-Year War, the Black Death struck Europe. October 1347. October 1347, ships stopped in Sicily full of dead and dying people. A sickness carried in fleas on the back of rats quickly swept through all the cities of Europe. Due to the overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, the disease easily spread. It was called the bubonic plague because of the large swelling that happens on the victims' bodies. They could get to the size of apples. Black splotches later spread across the victim, which is why it's called the Black Death. This disease was highly contagious and killed its victims within days of it being contracted in the victim. Statistics vary on the death count in Europe, but most agree it was at least 1/3 of the population of Europe that died. 1/3 of the people. Could you even imagine 1/3 of the people in America dying? That's insane. So 1/3 of the people of Europe died within the time period of the Black Plague. Now, don't think of this as within a year. It's over years of time of this happening, but still. But it wasn't just 1/3 in all locations. Some places it actually killed more. Paris lost half of their people, and Normandy is said to have lost between 70 to 80% of all their people. Many villages were nearly wiped out. It wasn't until the 2000s that some of these villages were actually discovered that had just been abandoned for hundreds of years. Many saw the Black Death as the wrath of God, and sadly, they turned to blaming people that had nothing to do with it. They turned to the Jews. They blamed the Jews either by it being a curse from God on the Jews, or Jews actually poisoning people's water or things like that. So people went out in a fury and killed thousands of Jews in brutal, brutal ways, such as burning them alive. The Black Death brought some horrible things, but oddly enough, it did actually bring some positive things to Europe. People started to be concerned about the public health. They worked on sanitary laws and made sure that things were cleaned out of the villages that shouldn't be left there, that were both people and animal droppings and things such as that. The laws were passed to help places to be cleaner and healthier. Free health care was provided to more people. The quarantine systems were starting to be set up. And best of all, hospitals started to be built and used by the masses. Between all the wars and the bubonic plague, there were a lot less peasants to do the work. Now, this led to something called the Peasants' Revolt. The peasants finally saw that they're valuable, that they're actually needed for the labors that they did. So they were tired of all the violence from the wars and all the sicknesses that were around them, and they were tired of bad treatment. So many peasant revolts happened. So it wasn't all at the same time, and it wasn't all in the same location. They happened in England, and they happened in Paris, they happened in Italy. It was all over Europe that peasants were rising up to receive better treatment. So, as I said, multiple peasant revolts rose up in the 1300s, fighting for different taxes, for their rents to be lowered, to fees to be lowered, to abolish serfs. They wanted fairer rents, fees, and taxes. It's not like they were asking that much. They wanted to be treated better. In some cases, this actually helped, and their living situations improved. In others, they were just sent packing. At the beginning of the 100-Year War, England was winning and dominating, but by the end of the 13th century, France had pushed England out of most of their lands. In 1377, Edward III of England died, and Richard II took his place on the throne. Richard was only 10 years old. Richard ruled from 1377 to 1399. In 1380, Charles V of France died, and Charles VI took his place on the throne at the age of 12. Now, both England and France had boy king rulers. Not just that, but Charles VI earned the nickname Charles the Mad. Charles suffered from bouts of insanity throughout his life, one being that he believed he was made of glass and could break at any moment. In 1392, Charles the Mad was involved in peace negotiations with Richard II. Sadly, this stalled out due to Charles suffering from a bout of insanity. Over on the southeastern side of Europe, during the 14th century, another empire was growing, the Ottoman Empire. This was an Islamic-led empire. Its first leader was Ottoman I. In 1299, Osman declared independence from the Seljuk Turks and went on his own war conquest. He captured multiple cities, and his heirs continued his expansion after he passed. In 1354, Ottoman conquerors captured their first European port city under the leadership of Sultan Murad I. He ruled from 1360 to 1389. They won major battles, gaining territories in Macedonia and the Balkans. Murad I continued pushing into Europe until 1389, when he was killed in battle. He was considered a martyr by his people. The Ottoman Empire was a powerful empire that lasted from the 14th century all the way to the 20th century. The last person we will learn about today is Timur the Lame, born 1336 in Central Asia, a Muslim of a Turkish clan who thought of himself as a Mongol warrior. In 1360, he put together a group of warriors called the Transoxiana. Timur the Lame lived his life on the saddle, going from village to village, leaving death and destruction behind him. Over 30 years, he captured Persia, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and parts of Russia. He sacked Delhi, India in 1398, leaving most of its people dead. He was known to execute all the males in a city he captured. In one place, he beheaded 70,000 people. In another, he buried 4,000 Christians alive. In 1404, Timur returned to his capital city, Samarkand, to celebrate his victories. The city was overflowing with spoils of war. Timur set out on a campaign against the Ming dynasty of China. On the way, he fell ill and died in 1405. The 14th century definitely had its problems. Between the Black Death and the 100-Year War, it was a hard time to be alive. Those poor peasants had a lot coming at them all at the same time, and the kings, they just kept on fighting. So I hope you enjoyed today's class and that you learned a couple new things. See you guys next week.